The Lancashire witches booked the third HOGHTON Tower, Downham Manor House, on a lovely morning about the middle of July in the same year as the events previously narrated. Nicholas Ashton, always astir with a lark, issued from his own dwelling and sauntered across the smooth lawn in front of it. The green eminence on which he stood was sheltered on the right by a grove of sycamores, forming the boundary of the park, and sloped down into a valley threaded by a small clear stream, whose murmuring as it danced over its pebbly bed distinctly reached his ear in the stillness of early day. On the left, partly in the valley and partly on the side of the acclivity on which the hall was situated, nestled the little village whose inhabitants owned Nicholas as lord, and to judge from their habitations they had reason to rejoice in their master, for certainly there was a cheerful air about Downham which the neighbouring hamlets, especially those in Pendle Forest, sadly wanted. On the left of the mansion, and only separated from it by the garden walls, stood the church, a venerable structure dating back to a period more remote even than Whalley Abbey. From the churchyard, a view almost similar to that enjoyed by the squire was obtained, though partially interrupted by the thick rounded foliage of a large tree growing beneath it, and many a traveller who came that way lingered within the hallowed precincts to contemplate the prospect. At the foot of the hill was a small stone bridge crossing the stream. Across the road, a scarce 30 paces from the church gate, stood a little alehouse, whose comfortable fireside nook and good liquors were not disdained by the squire. In fact, to his shame be it spoken, he was quite often to be found there of an evening as at the hall. This had more particularly been the case since the house was tenanted by Richard Baldwin, who, having given up the mill at Roughly and taken to his wife Bess Whitaker of Goldshore, had removed with her to Downham, where he now flourished under the special protection of the squire. Bess had lost none of her old habits of command, and it must be confessed that poor Richard played a very secondary part in the establishment. Nicholas, as may be supposed, was permitted considerable license by her, but even he had limits which he took good care he should not exceed. The Downham domains were well cultivated, the line of demarcation between them and the heathy wastes adjoining being clearly traced out, and you had only to follow the course of the brook to see at a glance where the purlieus of the forest ended and where Nicholas Ashton's property commenced, the one being a dreary moor with here and there a thicket upon it, but more frequently a dangerous morass covered with sulphur-coloured moss, and the other consisting of green meadows bordered in most instances by magnificent timber. The contrast, however, was not without its charm, and while the sterile wastes set off the fair and fertile fields around them and enhanced their beauty, they offered a wide uninterrupted expanse over which the eye could range at will. On the farther side of the valley, and immediately opposite the lawn whereon Nicholas stood, the ground gradually arose until it reached the foot of Pendle Hill, which here, assuming its most majestic aspect, constituted the grand and peculiar feature of the scene. Nowhere could the lordly eminence be seen to the same advantage as from this point, and Nicholas contemplated it with feelings of rapture which no familiarity could diminish. The sun shone brightly upon its rounded summit and upon its seamy sides, revealing all its rifts and ridges, adding depth of tint to its dusty soil, laid bare in places by the winter torrents, lending new beauty to its purple heath and making its rays so glow as with fire. So exhilarating was the prospect that Nicholas felt half tempted to cross the valley and scale the hill before breaking his fast, but other feelings checked him, and he turned towards the right. Here, beyond the paddock and some outbuildings, lay the park, small in extent but beautifully diversified, well stocked with deer, boasting much noble timber. In the midst was an exquisite knoll which, besides commanding a fine view of Pendle Hill, Downham, and all the adjacent country, brought within its scope on the one hand the ancient castle of Clitheroe and the heights overlooking Whalley, and on the other the lovely and extensive vale through which the Ribble wandered. This also was a favourite point of view with the squire, and he had some idea of walking towards it when he was arrested by a person who came from the house and who shouted to him hoarsely but blithely to stay. The newcomer was a man of middle age with a skin almost as tawny as the gypsies, a hooked nose, black evening brows, and eyes so strangely set in his head that they communicated a sinister expression to his countenance. He possessed burly frame, square and somewhat heavy, though not so much so as to impede his activity in deportment and stature. Though not in feature, he resembled the squire himself, and the likeness was heightened by his habiliments being part of Nicholas's old wardrobe, the doublet and hose, and even the green hat and boots being those in which Nicholas made his first appearance in this history. The personage who thus condescended to be fed and clothed at the squire's expense, and who filled a situation something between guest and menial, without receiving the precise attention of the one or the wages of the other, but who made himself so useful to Nicholas that he could not dispense with him neither. Perhaps would he have been shaken off even if it had been desired, was named Lawrence Fogg, an entire stranger to the country, whom Nicholas had put up at home, and whom he had invited to Downham for a few weeks hunting, and had never been able to get rid of since. Lawrence Fogg liked his quarters immensely, and determined to remain in them, and as a means to so desirable an end, he studied all the squire's weak points and peculiarities, and these not being very difficult to be understood, he soon mastered the squire into the bargain, but without allowing his success to become manifest. Nicholas was delighted to find one with tastes so congenial to his own, who was so willing to hunt or fish with him, who could train a hawk as well as Phil Royal, the falconer, diet a fighting cock as well as Tom Shaw, the cockmaster enter a hound better than Charles Coach, the whole huntsman shoot with a longbow farther than anyone except himself, and was willing to toss off a pot with him or sing a merry stave whenever he felt inclined. Such a companion was invaluable, and Nicholas congratulated himself upon the discovery, especially when he found Lawrence Fogg was not unwilling to undertake some delicate commissions for him which he could not well execute himself, and which he was unwilling should reach Mistress Assheton's ears. These were mangled with equal adroitness and caution. About the same time, too, Nicholas, finding money scarce and not liking to borrow it in person, delegated Fogg and sent him round to his friends to ask for a loan, but in this instance the mission was attended with very indifferent success, for not one of them would lend him so much as £30, all averring they stood in need of it quite as much as himself, though somewhat inconvenienced by their refusal. Nicholas bore the disappointment with his customary equanimity, and made merry with his friend as if nothing had happened. Fogg showed an equally accommodating spirit in all religious observances, and though much against his inclination, attended morning discourses and lectures with his patron, and even made an attempt at psalm singing, but on one occasion, missing the tune and coming in with a bacchanalian chorus, he was severely rebuked by the minister, and enjoined to keep silence in the future. Such was the friendly relation subsisting between the parties when they met together on the lawn on the morning in question. "Well, Fogg," cried Nicholas, after exchanging salutations with his friend, "what say you to hunting the otter in the Ribble after breakfast? 'Tis a rare day for the sport, and the hounds are in excellent order. There is an old dam and her litter whom we must kill, for she has been playing the very devil with a fish for a space of more than 2 miles, and if we let her off for another week, we shall have neither salmon, trout, nor umber, as all will have passed down the moors of her voracious brood." "And that would be a pity, in good sooth, squire," replied Fogg, "for there are no fish like those of the Ribble. Nothing I should prefer to the sport you promised, but I thought you had other business for me today. Another attempt to borrow money, eh?" "Aye, from my cousin Dick Assheton," rejoined Nicholas. "He will lend me the £30, I am quite sure, but you had better defer the visit till tomorrow, when his father, Sir Richard, will be at Warley, and when you can have have him to yourself. Dick will not say you nay depend on it. He is too good a fellow for that. And Moraine and those close-fisted curmudgeons, Roger Norwell, Nicholas Townley and Tom Whitaker, they ought to be delighted to oblige me, but they declare they have no money. Said Fogg. No money? Pho! Exclaimed Nicholas. An idle excuse. They are chests full. Would I had all Roger Norwell's gold, I should not require another supply for years. But sdeath, I will not trouble myself for a paltry £30, if I might venture to suggest, squire. While you are about it, I would ask for £100, or even 200 or 300, said Fogg. Your friends will think all the better of you, and feel more satisfied you intend to repay them. Do you think so? Cried Nicholas. Then by Plutus it shall be £300, 300 at interest. Dick will have to borrow the amount to lend it to me, but no matter, he will easily obtain it. Hark ye, Fogg, while you are at Middleton, endeavour to ascertain whether anything has been arranged about the marriage of a certain young lady to a certain young gentleman. I am curious to know the precise state of affairs in that quarter. I will arrive at the truth if possible, squire, replied Fogg, but I should scarcely think Sir Richard would assent to his son's union with the daughter of a notorious witch. Sir Richard's son is scarcely likely to ask Sir Richard's consent, said Nicholas. And as to Mistress Nutter, though heavy charges have been brought against her, nothing has been proved, for you know she escaped, or rather was rescued, on her way to Lancaster Castle. I am fully aware of it, squire, replied Fogg, and I more than suspect a worthy friend of mine had a hand in her deliverance, and could tell where to find her if needful, but that is neither here nor there. The lady is quite innocent, I dare say. Indeed, I am quite sure of it, since you espouse her cause so warmly. But the world is malicious, and strange things are reported of her. Heed not the world, Fogg, rejoined Nicholas. The world speaks well of no man, by his deserts what they may. The world says that I waste my estate in wine, women, and boar's flesh, that I spend time in pleasures which might be profitably employed, that I neglect my wife, forget my religious observances. I'm on horseback when I should be afoot, at the hale house when I should be at home, at a marriage when I should be at a funeral, shooting when I should be keeping my horse. In short, it has not a good word to say for me. And as for thee, Fogg, it says thou art an idle, good for nothing fellow, or if thou art good for all, it is only for something that leads to evil. It says thou drinkest prodigiously, liest confoundedly, and swearest most profoundly, that thou art ever more ready to go to the ale house than to church, and that none of the girls can escape thee. Nay, the slanderers even go so far as to assert thou wouldest not hesitate to say, stand and deliver to a true man on the highway. That is what the world says of thee. But hang it, never look chapfallen, man. Let us go in to breakfast, after which we will proceed to the Ribble and spear the old otter. A fine manorial residence was Downham, and beautifully situated, as has been shown, on a woody eminence to the north of Pendle Hill. It was a great antiquity, and first came into possession of the Assheton family in 1558. Considerable additions had been made to it by its present owner Nicholas, and the outlay necessarily required, combined with the lavish expenditure, had contributed to embarrass him. The stables were large and full of horses, the kennels on the same scale, and equally well supplied with hounds, and there was a princely retinue of servants in the yard, grooms, keepers, falconers, huntsmen, and their assistants, to say nothing of their fellows within doors. In short, if it had been your fortune to accompany the squire and his friends round the premises, if you had walked through the stables and counted the horses, if you had viewed the kennels and examined the various hounds, the great Lancashire dogs, tall, shaggy, and heavy, a race now extinct, the Worcestershire hounds, then also in much repute, the greyhounds, the harriers, the beagles, the lurchers, and lastly the Verminers, or as we should call them, the terriers. If you had seen all these, you would not have wondered that money was scarce with him. Still further would your surprise at such a consequence have diminished if you had gone on to the falconry and seen on the perches the gorshawk and the tercel, the sparrowhawk and musket under the care of the ostringer, and farther on the falcon gentle, the girt falcon, the lanner, the merlin and the hobby, all of which were attended to by the head falconer. It would have done good to hear Nicholas inquiring from his men if they had set out their birds that morning and whether them they had mummy powder in readiness, then esteemed sovereign remedy if the lures, hoods, jesters, skewers and all other needful furniture were in good order, and if the means were sweet and wholesome. You might next have followed him to the pens where the fighting cock were kept, and where you would have found another source of expense in the cockmaster Tom Shaw, a knave who not only got high wages from his master but understood so well the dieting of his birds that he could make them win or lose a battle as he thought proper. Here again Nicholas had much to say, and was in raptures with one cock which he told Foggy would back to any amount, utterly unconscious of a significant look that passed between his friend and the cockmaster. "Look at him," cried the squire, "how proud and erect he stands. His head is as small as that of a sparrow, or his eye large and quick, his body fit, his legs strong in the beam, and his spurs long, rough and sharp. That is the bird for me. I will take him over to the cockpit at Prescott next week and match him against any bird Sir John Talbot or my cousin Baldwin can bring." "And you win, squire," replied the cockmaster. "I have been feeding him these 5 weeks, so he'll be in rare condition then, and win a failure. You may lay what you like on him," he added with a sly wink at Fogg. "You may win £30 you want," observed the latter in a low tone to the squire. "Or mayhap lose it," replied Nicholas. "I shall not risk so much unless I get the 300 from Dick Ashton. I have been unlucky of late. You beat me constantly at tables now, Fogg, and when I first knew you, this was not born to be the case. Nay, never make any excuses, man. You cannot help it. Let us in to breakfast." With this, he proceeded towards a house, followed by Fogg and a couple of large Lancashire hounds, and entering at the back of the premises, made his way through the scullery into the kitchen. Here there were plentiful evidences of hospitality, not to say profusion, reigning throughout the mansion. An open door showed a larder stocked with all kinds of provisions, and before the fire joints of meat and poultry were roasting. Pies were baking in the oven, and over the flames in the chimney was suspended a pot large in for a witch's cauldron. The cook was busy in preparing for the gridiron some freshly caught trout intended for the squire's own breakfast, and the kitchen maid was toasting oat cakes, of which there was a large supply in the bread flake pending from the ceiling. Casting a look around and exchanging a few words with the cook, Nicholas moved on, still followed by Fogg and the hound, and trackling along the stone passage entered the great hall. Here the same disorder and irregularity prevailed as in his own character and conduct. All was litter and confusion. Around the walls were hung breastplates and buffcoats, morions, shields, and two-handed swords. They were half hidden by fishing nets, fowling nets, dogs' collars, saddles and bridles, housings, crossbows, longbows, clivers, baldricks, horns, spears, guns, and every other implement then used in the sports of the river or the field. The floor was an equal state of disorder. The rushes were filled with half-gnawed bone, brought thither by the hound, and in one corner on a mat was a favourite spaniel and her whelps. The squire, however, was happily insensible to the condition of the chamber, and looked around it with an air of satisfaction, as if he thought it the perfection of comfort. A table was spread for breakfast near a window looking out upon the lawn, and 2 covers only were laid for Mistress Nicholas Ashton did not make her appearance at this early hour, and now was exhibited one of those strange contradictions of which the squire's character was composed. Kneeling down by the side of the table, and without noticing the mocking expression of Fogg's countenance as he followed his example, Nicholas prayed loudly and fervently for upwards of 10 minutes, after which he arose and gave a shout which proved that his lungs were unimpaired, and not only roused the whole house but set all the dogs barking. Presently a couple of serving men answered this lusty summons, and the table was covered with good and substantial dishes, which he and his companion attacked with a vigour such as only the most valiant trencherman can display. Already has it been remarked that a breakfast at the period in question resembled a modern dinner, and better proof would not have been afforded of the correctness of the description than the meal under discussion, which comprised fish, flesh, and fowl, boiled, broiled, and roast, together with strong ale and sack. After an hour thus agreeably employed, and while they were still seated, though breakfast had pretty nearly men, a serving man, entered announcing Master Richard Sherborne of the North. The squire instantly sprang to his feet and hastened to welcome his brother-in-law. "Ah, good day to you, Dick," he cried, shaking him heartily by the hand. "What happy chance brings you here so early? But first sit down and eat and talk afterwards. Here, Roger, Harry, bring another platter and napkin, and let us have more broiled trout and a cold capon, a pasty or whatever you can find in the larder. Try some of this salmon meanwhile, Dick. It will help down a can of ale. And now what brings thee hither, lad? Pressing business, no doubt. Thou mayest speak before, for I have no secrets from him. He is my second self. I have no secrets to divulge, Nicholas, replied Sherborne, and I will tell you at once what I am come about. Have you heard that the king is about to visit HOGHTON Tower in August? No, this is news to me, replied Nicholas. Does your business relate to his visit? It does, replied Sherborne. Last night a messenger came to me from Sir Richard HOGHTON, entreating me to move you to do him the favour and courtesy to attend him at the king's coming and wear his livery. I wear his livery, exclaimed Nicholas indignantly. "Sir Death, what do you take me for, cousin Dick? For a right good fellow who I am sure will comply with his friend's request, especially when he finds there is no sort of degradation in it," replied Sherborne. "Why, I shall wear Sir Richard's cloth, and so will several others of our friends. There will be rare doings at HOGHTON, maskewings, mummings, and all sorts of revels, besides hunting, shooting, racing, wrestling, and the devil knows what. You may feast and carouse to your heart's content. The Dukes of Buckingham and Richmond will be there, and the Earls of Nottingham and Pembroke, and Sir Gilbert HOGHTON, the king's great favourite, who married the Duchess of Buckingham's sister. Besides thee, you will have all the beauty of Lancashire. I would not miss the sight for £30. £30, echoed Nicholas, as if struck with a sudden thought. Do you think Sir Richard HOGHTON would lend me that sum if I consent to wear his cloth and attend him? I have no doubt of it, replied Sherborne, and if he won't, I will. Then I will put my pride into my pocket and go, said Nicholas. And now, Dick, dispatch your breakfast as quickly as you can, and then I will take you to the Ribble and show you some sport with an otter. Sherborne was not long in concluding his repast, and having received an otter's spear from the squire, who had already provided himself and Fogg with light weapons, all three adjourned to the kennels, where they found the old huntsman Charlie Crouch awaiting them, attended by 4 stout varlets, armed with both staves, meant for the double purpose of eating the river's banks and striking the poor beasts they were about to hunt, and each man having a couple of hounds well entered for the chase in leash. Old Crouch was a thin, grey, bearded fellow, but possessed of a tough, muscular frame, which served him quite as well in the long run as the younger and apparently more vigorous limbs of his assistants. His cheek was pale, and his eye still bright and quick, and a certain fierceness was imparted to his countenance by a large aquiline nose. He was attired in a greasy leathern jerkin, tight hose of the same material, and had a bugle suspended from his neck, and a sharp hunting knife thrust into his girdle. In his hand he bore a spear like his master, and was followed by a grey old lurcher, who, though wanting an ear and an eye, and disfigured by sundry scars on throat and back, was hardy, untiring, and sagacious. This ancient dog was called Grip, from his tenacity in holding anything he set his teeth on, and he and Crouch were inseparable. Great was the clamour occasioned by the squire's appearance in the yard. The couple of hounds gave tongue at once and sang out most melodiously, and all the other dogs within the kennels, or roaming at will about the yard, joined the concert. After much swearing, cracking of whips, and yelping consequent upon the cracking silence, was in some degree restored, and the consultation was then held between Nicholas and Crouch as to where their steps should first bend. The old huntsman was for drawing the river near a place called Bean Hill Wood, as the trees thereabouts growing close to the water's edge, it was pretty certain the otter would have heard couch amid the roots of some of them. This was objected to be by one of the varlets, who declared that the beast lodged in a hollow tree, standing on a bank nearly a mile higher up the stream, and close by the point of junction between Swanside Beck and the Ribble. He was certain of the fact, he avouched, because he had noticed marks on the moist grass near the tree. Who goes there to fish, man? Cried Vouch, for it is the nature of the wary varmint to feed at a distance from her lodging. But I am sure we shan't lit on her among the roots of them big trees overhanging the river near Bean Hill Wood, and if the squire'll take my advice, go there first. I put myself entirely under your guidance, Crouch, said Nicholas. And you be all read, sir, replied the huntsman. We'll beat the banks well, and 2 of these chaps shall go up the stream and 2 down, one on one side and one the other, and that man manor who cannot escape us, for Griff can swim and dive as well as on otter. I Englandshire, and he's the after and Earl litter. The moment they take towards her, some folk as maybe you have seen Squire take hold on a cord by both ends and dropping it into the river, row it slowly along so that they can tell by the jerk where the otter touches it. But this is an Alsatian method, and it is nothing like Griffland or wherever you see him swimming. The other beast you may be sure is not far ahead. A brave dog, but confoundedly ugly, exclaimed the Squire, regarding the old one-eared, one-eyed lurcher with mingled admiration and disgust. And now that all is arranged, let us be off. Accordingly, they quitted the courtyard and, shaping their course in the direction indicated by the huntsman, entered the park and proceeded along a glade checkered by the early sunbeams. Here the noise they made in their progress speedily disturbed a herd of deer browsing beneath the trees, and as the dappled foresters darted off to a thicker covert, great difficulty was experienced by the varlets in refraining the hounds, who struggled eagerly to follow them and made the welkin resound with their baying. Yonder is a tall fellow, cried Nicholas, pointing out a noble buck Crouch. I must kill him next week, for I want to send a haunch of venison to Middleton and another to Whalley Abbey for Sir Ralph. Better hunt him, Squire, said Crouch. He will give ye good sport. Soon after this they attained an eminence where a charming sweep of country opened upon them, including the finest part of Ribblesdale, with its richly wooded plains and the swift and beautiful river from which it derived its name. The view was enchanting, and the Squire and his companions paused for a moment to contemplate it, and then, stepping gleefully forward, made their way over the elastic turf towards a small thicket skirting the park. All were in high spirits, for the freshness and beauty of the morning had not been without effect, and the Squire's tongue kept pace with his legs as he strode briskly along. But as they entered the thicket in question and caught sight of the river through the trees, the old huntsman enjoined silence, and he was obliged to put a check upon his loquacity. When within a bow shot from the water, the party came to a halt, and two of the men were directed by Crouch to cross the stream at different points and then commence beating the bank, while the other two were ordered to pursue a like course and to keep on the near side of the river. The hounds were next coupled, and the men set off to execute the orders they had received, and soon afterwards the crashing of branches and the splashing of water, accompanied by the baying of the hound, told they were at work. Meanwhile, Nicholas and the others had not remained idle, and as the violets stood off in different directions, they went straight on, and forcing their way through the brushwood, came to a high bank overlooking the Ribble, on the top of which grew 3 or 4 large trees, whose roots lay bare on the farther side of swollen currents of winter, formed a convenient resting place for the fish-loving creature they hoped to surprise. Receiving a hint from Crouch to make for the central tree, Nicholas grasped his spear and sprang forward, but quick as he was too late. So he saw enough to convince him that the crafty old huntsman had been correct in his judgment, for a dark, slimy object dropped from out the roots of the tree beneath him and glided into the water as swiftly and as noiselessly as if its skin had been oiled. A few bubbles rose to the surface of the water, but those were all the indications marking the course of the wondrous diver. But other eyes, sharper than those of Nicholas, were on the watch, and the old huntsman shouted out, "There who goes grip after lad after." The words were scarcely uttered when the dog sprang from the top of the bank and sunk under the water. For some seconds no trace could be observed of either animal, and then the shaggy nose of the lurcher was seen nearly 50 yards higher up the river, and after sniffing around for a moment and fixing his single eye on his master, who was standing on the bank and encouraging him with his voice and gesture, he dived again. "Station yourselves on the bank 50 paces apart," cried Crouch. "Run, run, or you'll be too late, and strike as quickly as leap if you have a chance. Stay where you are, Squire," he added to Nicholas. "You cannot be better placed." All was now animation and excitement. Perceiving from the noise that the otter had been found, the 4 varlets hastened towards the scene of action, and by their shouts and the clatter of their staves contributed greatly to its spirit. 2 were on one side of the stream and 2 on the other, and up to this moment the hounds were similarly separated, but now most of them had taken to the water, some swimming about, others standing up to the middle in the shallower part of the current, watching with keen gaze for the appearance of their anticipated victim. Having descended the bank, Nicholas had so placed himself among the huge twisted roots of the tree that if the otter, alarmed by the presence of so many falls and unable to escape either up or down the river, should return to her couch, he made certain of striking her. At first there seemed little chance of such an occurrence, for Fogg, who had gone 100 yards higher up, suddenly instantly dashed into the stream, plunging his spear into the mud, cried out that he had hit the beast. But the next moment, when he drew the weapon forth and exhibited a large rat which he had transfixed, his mistake excited much merriment. Old Crouch, meantime, did not suffer his attention to be drawn from his dog. Every now and then he saw him come to the surface to breathe, but as he kept within a short distance, rising at different points, the old huntsman felt certain the otter had not got away, and having the utmost reliance upon Grip's perseverance and sagacity, he felt confident he would bring the quarry to him if the thing were possible. The varlets kept up an incessant clatter, beating the water with their staves and casting large stones into it, while the hound bayed furiously, so that the poor fugitive was turned on whichever side she attempted a retreat. While this was going on, Nicholas was cautioned by the huntsman to look out, and scarcely had an admonition reached him than the sleek shining body of the otter emerged from the water and read itself among the roots. The squire instantly dealt a blow which he expected to prove fatal, but his mortification was excessive when he found he had driven the spearhead so deep into the tree that he could scarcely disengage it, while an almost noiseless lunge told that his prey had escaped. Almost at the same moment that the poor beast had sought its old lodging, the untiring lurcher had appeared at the edge of the bank, and as the former again went down, dived likewise. Secretly laughing at the squire's failure, the old huntsman prepared to take advantage of a similar opportunity if it should present itself, and with this view esconded himself behind a hollowed window which stood beside the stream, and whence he could watch closely all that passed without being exposed to view. Prudence of the step was soon manifest. After the lapse of a few seconds, during which neither dog nor otter had risen to breathe, a slight, very slight undulation was perceptible on the surface of the water. Crouch's grasp tightened on his staff. He waited another moment, then dashed forward, struck down his spear and raised it aloft. The poor otter transfixed and writhing upon his point. Loudly and exultingly did the old man shout at his triumph, and loudly were his vocations answered by the others. All flew to the spot where he was standing, and the hounds gathered around him, yelled furiously at the otter, and showed every disposition to tear her in pieces if they could get at her. Kicking the noisiest and fiercest of them out of the way, Crouch approached the river's brink and lowered a spearhead till it came within reach of his favourite Grip, who had not yet come out of the water, but stood within its depth with his one red eye fixed on the enemy. He had so hotly pursued, and fully expecting his reward, it now came. His sharp teeth instantly met in the otter's throat, and when Crouch swung them both in the air, he still maintained his hold, showing how well he deserved his name. Nor could he be disengaged until long after the suffering of the tortured animal had ceased. To say that Nicholas was neither chagrined at his ill success nor jealous of the old huntsman's superior skill would be to affirm an untruth, but he put the best face he could upon the matter, and praised Grip very highly, alleging that the whole merit of the hunt rested with him. Old Crouch let him go on, and when he had done, quietly observed that the otter they had destroyed was not the one they came in search of, as they had seen nothing of her litter, and that most likely the beast that had done so much mischief had her lodging in the hollow tree near the swan side bed, as described by the varlet, and he wished to know whether the squire would like to go and hunt her. Nicholas replied that he was quite willing to do so, and hoped he should have better luck on the second occasion, and with this they set forward again, taking their way along the side of the stream, beating the banks as they went, without bruising anything beyond an occasional water rat, which was killed almost as soon as found by Grip. Somehow or another, without anyone being aware what led to it, the conversation fell upon the old witches, mothers Demdike and Chattox, and the strange manner in which their career had terminated on the summit of Pendle Hill, if indeed it could be said to have terminated, when their spirits were reported to haunt the spot, and might be seen, it was asserted, at midnight, flitting round the beacon and shrieking dismally. The restless shades were pursued. It was added by the figure of a monk in white mouldering robes, supposed to be the ghost of Haslow. It was difficult to understand how these apparitions could be witnessed, since no one, even for a reward, could be prevailed upon to ascend Pendle Hill after nightfall, but the shepherds affirmed they had seen them from below, and that was testimony sufficient to shake the most sceptical. One singular circumstance was mentioned which must not pass by without notice, and this was that when the cinders of the extinct beacon fire came to be examined, no remains whatever of the two hags could be discovered, though the ashes were carefully sifted, and it was quite certain that the flames had expired long before their bodies could be consumed. The explanation attempted for this marvel was was that Satan had carried them off while yet living and finished their combustion in a still more fiery region. Mention of Mother MD naturally led to her grandson Jem Device, who, having escaped in a remarkable manner on the night in question, notwithstanding the cry made after him, had not as yet been captured, though he had been occasionally seen at night and under peculiar circumstances by various individuals, and amongst others by old Crouch, who however declared he had been unable to lay hands on him. Allusion was then made to Mistress Nutter, whereupon it was observed that the squire changed the conversation quickly, while sundry sly winks and shrugs were exchanged among the varlets of the kennel, seeming to intimate that they knew more about the matter than they cared to admit. Nothing more, however, was elicited than that the escort, conducting her to Lancaster Castle, together with the other witches, after their examination before the magistrates at Warley and committal, had been attacked while it was passing through a woody defile in Bowland Forest by a party of men in the garb of foresters, and the lady set free, nor had she been heard of since. What made this rescue the more extraordinary was that not one of the other witches was liberated at the same time, but some of them who seemed disposed to take advantage of the favourable interposition and endeavour to get away were brought back by the foresters to officers of justice, thus clearly proving that the attempt was solely made on Mistress Nutter's account and must have been undertaken by her friends. Nothing, it was asserted, could equal the rage and mortification of Roger, Norwell and Potts on learning that their chief prey had thus escaped them, and by their directions for more than a week the strictest search was made for the fugitive throughout the neighbourhood, but without effect. No clue could be discovered to her retreat. Suspicion naturally fell upon the two Ashton, Nicholas and Richard, and Roger Norwell roundly tasked them with contriving and executing the enterprise in person, while Potts told them they were guilty of misprision of felony and threatened them with imprisonment for life, forfeiture of goods and of rents for the offence. But as the charge could not be proved against them, notwithstanding all the efforts of magistrate and attorney, it fell to the ground, and Master Potts, told how chagrin at this unexpected and vexatious termination of the affair, returned to London and settled himself in his chambers in Chancery Lane. His duties, however, as clerk of the court would necessarily call him to Lancaster in August, when the Caesars commenced, and when he would assist in the trials of such other wishes as were still in jurors. From Mother Demby, it was natural that the conversation should turn to her weird retreat to Malkin Tower, and Richard Sherborne expressed his surprise that the unhallowed structure should be suffered to remain standing after her removal. Nicholas said he was equally anxious with his brother-in-law for its demolition, but it was not so easily to be accomplished as it might appear, for the deserted structure was in such ill repute with the common folk as well as everyone else that no one dared approach it even in the daytime. A Bogart, it was said, had taken possession of its vaults and scared away all who ventured near it, sometimes showing himself in one frightful shape and sometimes in another, now as a monstrous goat, now as an equally monstrous cat, uttering fearful cries, glaring with fiery eyes from out of the windows, or appearing in all its terror on the summit of the tower. Moreover, the haunted structure was frequently lighted at dead of night. Strains of unearthly music were heard resounding from it, and wild figures were seen flitting past the windows as if engaged in dancing and revelry, so that it appeared that no alteration for the better would take place there, and that things were still quite as improperly conducted now as they had been in the time of Mother Demby or in those of her predecessors, Isolde, Hetton and Blackburn the robber. The common opinion was that Satan and all his imps had taken up their abode in the tower, and as they light their waters, led a jolly life there, dancing and drinking all night long. It would be useless at present to give them notice to it, still less to attempt to pull down that house about their ears. Richard Sherborne heard this wondrous relation in silence, but with a look of incredulity, and when it was done, he winked slyly at his brother-in-law. A strange expression, half comical, half suspicious, might also have been observed on Fogg's countenance, and he narrowly watched the squire as the latter saw. But with the disappearance of the malignant old hags who were so long invested the neighbourhood, had all mischief and calamity ceased, or were people as much afflicted as hitherto? Were there, in short, so many cases of witchcraft, real or supposed? This was the question next addressed by Sherborne to Nicholas. The squire answered decidedly there was not. Since the burning of the two old Baldings and the imprisonment of the others, the whole district of Pendle had improved. All those who had been smitten with strange illnesses had recovered, and the inhabitants of the littlest village of Saddon, who had experienced the fullest effects of their malignity, were entirely free from sickness. And not only had they and their families suddenly regained health and strength, for all belonging to them had undergone a similar beneficial change, the kind that had lost their milk now yielded it abundantly. The lame horse halted no longer. The murrain ceased among the sheep. The pigs that had worn lean and missed abundance fattened rapidly, and though the farrows that had perished during the evil ascendancy of the witches could not be brought back again, their place promised speedily to be supplied by others. The corn, blighted early in the year, had sprung forth anew, and the trees knit in the bud were laden with fruit. In short, all was as fair and as flourishing as it had recently been the reverse. Amongst others, John Law, the pedlar, who had been deprived of the use of his limbs by the damnable arts of Mother Demdike, had marvellously recovered on the very night of her destruction, and was now as strong and as active as ever. Such happy results having followed the removal of the witches, it was to be hoped, Sherborne said, that the riddance would be complete, and that none of the obnoxious brood would be left to inflict future miseries on their fellows. This could not be the case so long as James Device was allowed to go at large, nor while his mother Elizabeth Device, a notorious witch, was suffered to escape with impunity. There was also Janet Elizabeth's daughter, a mischievous and ill-favoured little creature who inherited all the ill qualities of her parent. These were the spawn of the old snake, and until they were entirely exterminated, there could be no security against a recurrence of the evil. Again, there was Nance Redfern, old Chattox's granddaughter, a comely woman in no but a reputed witch, and an undoubted fabricator of clay images. She was still at liberty, though she ought to be with the rest in the dungeons of Lancaster Castle. It was useless to allege that with the destruction of the old hags, all danger had ceased. Common prudence would keep the others quiet now, but the moment the storm passed over, they would resume their atrocious practices, and all would be as bad as ever. No, the tree must be utterly uprooted, or it would inevitably burst forth anew. With these opinions, Nicholas generally concurred, but he expressed some sympathy for Nance Redfern, whom he thought far too good looking to be as wicked and malicious as represented. But however that might be, and however much he might desire to get rid of the family of the Devices, he feared such a step might be attended with danger to Alison, and that she might in some way or other be implicated with them. The last remark he addressed in an undertone to his brother-in-law. Sherborne did not at first feel any apprehension on that score, but on reflection he admitted that Nicholas was perhaps right, and though Alison was now the recognised daughter of Mistress Hunter, yet her long and intimate connection with the Device family might operate to her prejudice, while her near relationship to an unvowed witch would not tend to remove the unfavourable impression. Sherborne then went on to speak in the most rapturous terms of the beauty and goodness of the young girl who formed the subject of their conversation, and declared he was not in the least surprised that Richard Ashton was so much in love with her, and yet he added a most extraordinary change to take place in her since the dreadful night on Pendle Hill, when her mother's guilt had been proclaimed, and when her arrest had taken place as an offender of the darkest dye. Alison, he said, had lost none of her beauty, but her light and joyous expression of countenance had been supplanted by a look of profound sadness, which nothing could remove. Gentle and meek in her deportment, she seemed to look upon herself as under a ban, and as if she were unfit to associate with the rest of the world. In vain Richard Ashton and his sister endeavoured to remove this impression by the tenderest assiduities. In vain they sought to induce her to enter in amusements consistent with her years. She declined all society but their own, and passed the greater part of her time in prayer. Sherborne had seen her so engaged, and the expression of her countenance, he declared, was seraphic. On the extreme verge of a high bank situated at the point of junction between the Swanside Beck and the Ribble stood an old decayed oak. Little of the once mighty tree beyond the gnarled trunk was left, and this was completely hollow, while there was a great rift near the bottom, though which a man might easily creep, and when once in, stand erect without inconvenience. Beneath the bank the river was deep and still, forming a pool where the largest and fattest fish were to be met with. In addition to this, the spot was extremely secluded, being rarely visited by the angler on account of the thick course by which it was surrounded, and which extended along the bank from the point of confluence between the lesser and the larger streams. Downham Mill, near half a mile distant, the sides of the Ribble were here as elsewhere beautifully wooded, and as the clear stream winded along through banks of every diversity of shape and character, and covered by forest trees of every description and of the most luxuriant growth, the effect was enchanting, the more so that the sun, having now risen high in the heavens, poured down a flood of summer heat and radiance that rendered these cool shades inexpressibly delightful. Pleasant was it as a huntsman leaped from stone to stone to listen to the sound of the waters rushing past them, pleasant as they sprang upon some green orm or fairy islet, standing in the midst of the stream and dividing its lucid waters, to suffer the eye to follow the course of the rapid current, and to see it here, sparkling in the bright sunshine, there plunged in shade by the overhanging trees, now fringed with osiers and rushes, now embanked with smoothest sward of emerald green, and undefended by steep rocks, sometimes bold and bare, but more frequently clothed in timber, then sinking down by one of those sudden but exquisite transitions which nature alone dares display, from this savage and sombre character into the softest and gentlest expressions, everywhere varied, yet everywhere beautiful. Those such scenes of southern loveliness had a huntsman passed on their way to the hollow oak, and they had ample leisure to enjoy them, because the squire and his brother-in-law, being engaged in conversation as before related, made frequent pauses, and during these the others halted likewise, and even the hound, glad of a respite, stood still or amused themselves by splashing about amid the shallows without any definite object unless of cooling themselves. Then as the leaders once more moved forward, arose the cheering shout, the loud bay, the clattering of staves, the crashing of branches, and all the other inspiriting noises accompanying the progress of the hunt. But for some minutes these had again ceased, and as Nicholas and Sherburne lingered beneath the shade of a widespread tree growing out on a sandy hillock near the stream, and seemed deeply interested in their talk, as well they might, for it related to Alison the whole troop, including Fogg, held respectfully aloof and awaited their pleasure to go on. The signal to move was at length given by the squire, who saw they were now not more than 100 yards from the bank on which stood a hollow tree they were anxious to reach. As the river here made a turn and swept round the point in question, forming, owing to this detention, the deep pool previously mentioned, the bank almost facing them, and as nothing intervened, they could almost look into the rift near the base of the tree, forming, they supposed, the entrance to the otter's couch. But all this was easily distinguished, no traces of the predatory animal could be seen, and though many sharp eyes were fixed upon the spot during the prolonged discourse of the two gentlemen, nothing had occurred to attract their attention, and to prove that the object of their quest was really there. After some little consultation between the squire and Crouch, it was agreed that the former should alone force his way to the tree, while the others were to station themselves with the hounds at various points of the stream, above and below the bank, so that if the otter and her litter escaped their first assailant, they should infallibly perish by the hands of some of the others. This being agreed upon, the plan was instantly put into execution, two of the varlets remaining where they were, two going higher up, while Sherborne and Fogg stationed themselves on great stones in the middle of the stream, whence they could command all around them, and Crouch waded on with grip, planted himself at the entrance of Swan's side bet into the ribble. Meanwhile, the squire, having scaled the bank, entered a thick covert encircling it, and not without some damage to his face and hands from the numerous thorns and brambles growing amongst it, forced his way upwards until he reached the bare space surrounding the hollow tree, and this attained, his first business was to ascertain that all was in readiness below before commencing the attack. A glance showed him on one side, old Crouch standing up to his middle in the bed, grasping his long otter spear, with grip beating the water in front of him in anxious expectation of employment, and in front Fogg, Sherborne, and two of the varlets, with their hounds so disposed that they could immediately advance upon the otter if it plunged into the river, while its passage up or down would be stopped by their comrades. All this he discerned at a glance, and comprehending from a sign made him by the old huntsman that he should not delay, he advanced towards the tree and was about to plunge his spear into the hole, hoping to transfix one at least of its occupants, when he was startled by hearing a deep voice apparently issue from the hollows of the timber, bidding him beware. What accursed thing addresses me? Said, standing on his guard. What is it? Speak, get hence, Nicholas Ashton, replied the voice, and meddle not with them, or meddle not with thee. Ah, exclaimed the squire, recovering courage, for he thought this did not sound like the language of a demon. I am known, am I? Why should I go hence, and at whose bidding? Ask no questions, man. Oh, he, replied the voice, or it shouldn't be worse for thee. I am the boggart of the club, and if thou bringest me out and tear thee in pieces with my claws and cast thee into the river, so that thy own hound shall eat people. Ha, sayest thou so, Master Boggart, cried Nicholas, for I swear thou usest the vernacular of the country fairly in, but before trying whether they had proof against mortal weapons, I command thee to come forth and declare thyself, that I may judge what manner of thing thou art. Thou hast best let me be I tell thee, replied Bogart roughly. I, methinks I should know whose accents, exclaimed the squire, that I marvellously resemble the voice of an offender who has too long evaded justice, and whom I have now fairly entrapped. Jem Device, thou art known, lad, and if thou dost not surrender at discretion, I will strike my spear through this rotten tree, and split thee as I would the beast I came in quest of, and which you would more easily than me, poor Jem. And suddenly springing from the hole at the foot of the tree, passed between the squire's legs with great promptitude, and flinging him face foremost upon the ground, crawled to the edge of the bank, and then dropped into the deep pool below. Roused all the spectators who, though they had heard what had passed and had seen the squire upset in the manner described, had been so much astounded that they could render no assistance, but they now one and all bestirred themselves actively to seize the diver when he should rise to the surface. But though every eye was on the lookout and every arm raised, though the hounds were as eager as their masters and yelling fiercely, swam around the pool, ready pounced on the swimmer as upon a door, all were disappointed, for even after a longer interval than their patience could, he did not appear. By this time Nicholas had regained his legs, and infuriated by his discomfiture, approached the edge of the bank, and peering down below, hoped to detect the fugitive immediately beneath him, resolved to show him no mercy when he caught him. But he was equally at fault with the others, and after more than 5 minutes spent in ineffectual search, he ordered Crouch to send Grit into the pool. The old keeper replied that the dog was not used to this kind of chase, and might not display his usual skill in it, but as the squire would take no nay, he was obliged to consent, and the other hounds were called off, lest they should puzzle him. Twice did the shrewd lurcher swim round the pool, sniffing the air, after which he approached the shore, and centred close to the bank, but still it was evident he could detect nothing, and Nicholas began to despair when the dog suddenly dived. Expectation was then raised to the utmost, and all were on the watch again. Nicholas leaned over the edge of the bank with his spear in hand prepared to strike, but the dog was so long in reappearing that he had given him up for lost, and his master was giving utterance to ejaculations of grief and rage, and vowing vengeance against the warlock, when Grit's gristly head was once again seen above the surface of the water, and this time he had a piece of blue surge in his jaws, proving that he had hold of the raiment of the fugitive, and that therefore the latter could not be far off, but had most probably got into some hole beneath the bank. No sooner was the notion suggested than it was acted on by the old huntsman and fog, and wading forward they pricked the bank with their spears at various points below the level of the water. All at once Fog fell forward. His spear had entered a hole and had penetrated so deeply that he had lost his balance, and though soused over head and ears, he had made a successful hit. For the next moment Jem Device appeared above the water, and before he could dive again his throat was seized by Grit, and while struggling to free himself from the fangs of the tenacious animal, he was laid hold of by Crouch and the varlets. Rushing forward to the latter's assistance, the ruffian was captured. Some difficulty was expected in rescuing the captive from the jaws of the hounds, who, infuriated by his struggles and perhaps mistaken him for some strange beast of chase, made their sharp teeth meet in various parts of his person, rending his garments from his limbs, and would no doubt have rent the flesh also if they had been permitted. At length, after much fighting and struggling, mingled with yells and vociferations, Jem was borne ashore and flung on the ground, where he presented a wretched spectacle, bleeding, half drowned, and covered with slime, acquired during his occupation of the hole in the bank. But though unable to offer further resistance, his spirit was not well, and his eye glared terribly at his captors, fearing they might have further trouble with him. When he recovered from his present exhausted condition, Crouch had his hands bound tightly together with one of the dog leashes, and then would fain have questioned him as to how he managed to breathe in a hole below the level of the water, but Jem refused to satisfy his curiosity, and returned only a sullen rejoinder to any questions addressed to him, until the squire, who had crossed the river at some stepping stones lower down, came up, and the ruffian then inquired in a half-menacing tone what he meant to do with him. "What do I mean to do with you?" cried Nicholas. "I will tell you, lad. I shall send you at once to Warley to be examined before the magistrates, and as the proofs are pretty clear against you, you will be forwarded without any material delay to Lancaster Castle, and you will rescue me by the way as had done a certain notorious witch and murderess," replied Jem fiercely. "Take heed what you done, squire. If I speak at all, I shan't speak out, and to some purpose I warrant ye. If I go to Lancaster Castle, I winna go alone. One of your friends shall go with me." "Cursed villain, I guess thy meaning," replied Nicholas, "but thy vindictive purpose purposes will be frustrated, no credence will be attached to thy false charges. While as to the lady thou aimest at, she is luckily beyond the reach of thy malice. Dunna be too sure of that, Squire, replied Jem. I can put the officers of justice as surely on her track as old Crouch could set those hounds on an otter. Lay your account on it, and I winna be unavenged. Heed him not towards Sherborne, seeking that the Squire was shaken by his threat and taking him apart. It will not do to let such a villain escape. He can do you no injury. And as to Mistress Nutter, if you know where she is, it will be easy to give her a hint to get out of the way. I don't know that, replied Nicholas thoughtfully. If I might be so bold as to offer my advice, Squire, said old Crouch, advancing towards his master, had he a heavy stone round the belly's throttle and chuck him into the pool, and he'll tell no tales for all his bragging. That would silence him effectually, no doubt, Crouch, replied Nicholas, laughing. But a dog's death is too good for him, and besides, I am pretty sure his destiny is not drowning. No, at all risks he shall go to Warley. Harky Fog, he added, beckoning that worthy to him, I commit the conduct and custody of the prisoner to you. Clap him on the horse, get on another yourself, take these 4 varlets with you, and deliver him into the hands of Sir Ralph Assheton, who will relieve you of all further trouble and responsibility. But you may add this to the baronet from me, he continued in an undertone. I recommend him to place under immediate arrest Elizabeth Device, the prisoner's mother, and her daughter Janet. You understand, Fog? Perfectly, returned the other with a somewhat singular look, and your instructions shall be fulfilled to the letter. Have you anything more to commit to me? Only this, said Nicholas. You may tell Sir Ralph that I propose to sleep at the Abbey tonight. I shall ride over to Middleton in the course of the day to confer with Dick Assheton upon what has just occurred, and get the money from him, the £300. You understand? And when my errand is done, I will turn bridle towards Warley. I shall return by Todmorden and through the gorge of Cliviger. You may as well tarry for me at the Abbey, for Sir Ralph will be glad of thy company, and we can return together to Downham tomorrow. As the Squire thus spoke, he noticed a singular sparkle in Fog's ill-set eyes, but he thought nothing of it at the time, though it subsequently occurred to his recollection. Meanwhile, the prisoner, finding no grace likely to be shown him, shouted out to the Squire that if he were set free, he would make certain important disclosures to him respecting Fog, who was not what he represented himself. But Nicholas treated the offer with disdain, and the individual mainly interested in the matter, who appeared highly incensed by Jem's malignity, cut this short peg by way of gag, and thrusting it into the ruffian's mouth, effectually checked any more revelations on his part. Fog then ordered the varlets to bring on the prisoner, but as Jem obstinately refused to move, they were under the necessity of taking him on their shoulders and transporting him in this manner to the stables, where he was placed on a horse as directed by the Squire.